media networks are expanding quickly, but many are still struggling to translate investment into meaningful in-store performance. As retailers evaluate whether to build closed ecosystems or adopt more flexible hybrid models, the real challenge is no longer about deploying screens. It's about designing for monetization, control, and relevance from the start. Welcome to CSP's At Your Convenience podcast. My name is Abby Lewis. I'm the Vice President of Content Strategy here at CSP. And today we're talking to Drew Walls. Drew is the Sales Director for Retail Media at Broadsign. In this conversation, we're going to talk about what it actually takes to build a retail media network that performs in the real world, from the trade-offs between closed and hybrid ecosystems to how retailers should think about monetization strategy, demand access, and in-store contextual relevance. This discussion really should unpack the operational realities behind scaling retail media successfully. So we're going to really dig in to why in-store remains one of the most under-leveraged channels in retail media today, and what separates networks that plateau from those that evolve into durable revenue-generating media businesses. Welcome to the podcast, Drew. We're so glad you're here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Abby. I'm really happy to be here.
Good. So we're going to start off here and talk a little bit about some of the struggles retailers might be having. Where do you see them struggling most when it comes to turning in-store media into real performance outcomes?
Yeah, so I don't think that retailers are really struggling from making bad decisions or a bad call, right? I think a majority of them are making the normal ones that's right for their business at that time in place. And so I think most people are going to think, do we get the screens up first and then potentially consider this operating model layer down the road, right? And by all intents and purposes, you have a CapEx conversation, an investment conversation that happens internally to get your screens. And so I think that's the natural progression. But I think that there's a specific opportunity that we're seeing across the industry in that we are still pricing the screen and not necessarily the moment. Right. I think when we think about the different trips with specifically in C-Store, my 7 a.m. coffee run looks very different than, a cold vault visit after I get off work at 5:30, and so those media units are very different. Right. My mission is different. And so I think oftentimes when we're considering pricing every screen hour the same, right, I think your highest intent moments at some points will subsidize the lowest, right? And so not everybody might see that, but because the inventory might look sold through, right? So I definitely think that there's a transition into driving business outcomes and what makes those real and how we view how we're pricing the screen today.
Okay, so Drew, what do you think are the real trade-offs that retailers should be thinking about when they're choosing between a closed system and a more open hybrid approach?
Yeah. I don't think the question isn't necessarily a closed versus open, right? I think there's a lot of nuance behind that to sort of consider. But on one end of the spectrum, if we're going to outsource everything, then you're sort of beholden to someone else's roadmap, right? At the end of the day. So your business priorities 3 years from now, really need to sync up with your vendors, right? On the opposite end of that spectrum, what if we just build everything ourselves internally, right? It's a very arduous task. I would argue that it is a very big cultural shift also within the organization to implement. Right. And so I think that there's things to consider there. But I think the real question is really for a retailer specifically is, will my partner grow with me, or am I eventually going to outgrow my partner? Right. I think, a 53 regional store chain is very different than a 3,000 store, chain, obviously. And these two examples are at totally different stages of their business, right, with different strategies. So I think the right answer necessarily designs to your stage at that moment, right? So it doesn't force necessarily one model.
So what parts of retail media stack should retailers absolutely retain control over? Say they didn't build it themselves, they have a partner, versus where it makes sense to lean on those external partners.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that there's really two instances that the IAB agrees with, and then I think that's been pretty well evangelized across the industry so far, is the audience data and then the direct relationships with their brands, right? that's where a lot of the durable margin is going to compound anyway. A lot of these retailers, they might have 6 billion first party data points, right, from their loyalty programs. You can always rent screens, but you can't necessarily rent 6 years worth of shopper data, so that obviously would set with the retailer. But I think the one that businesses tend to give up and they don't necessarily realize it at first is the measurement methodology. It's really going to be the crux and the credibility multiplier that proves the success of the network, right? That advertisers and brands are really going to care the most about. And so I think that important question for a business coming to a platform or another vendor should necessarily be who validates that. It should live with the retailer and their analytics partner. But if that answer actually comes back onto the vendor side, then I think that's a trade that a business doesn't necessarily want to make.
Sure. So then, in your opinion, what does a well-structured hybrid retail media network actually look like in practice?
Sure. Well, I think there's several different layers to this, right? So there's two in particular that I think decide whether architecture really holds up. And the first one would probably be commercial separation. And that literally means who sends the invoice, right? I think retailers going through the process of standing up an RMN value transparency. They value optionality and not having to be locked into a certain model. So when everyone bills the retailer directly, they own their own KPIs. Nobody's going to be marking up layers around the other partners, and I think that kills margin leakage and lock in at the same time. The second thing I would say is I've mentioned earlier was optionality, right?
Yeah.
Like if I were to reassess my stack or the architecture, am I able to pull something out or optimize one part of my layer without losing my content, my data, my demand path, right? Like, do I have that optionality to sort of flex to my new business requirements or how my business has been evolving? And then on the platform side, obviously a giant layer of all this as the infrastructure underneath. I think that there's a lot of times we will accept the fate that there are existing screens in a store, there's existing hardware. Very, very seldom do you come in at the very front end of a process where decisions are being made for the hardware and the screens alongside software, right? And again, this might be a business kind of doubling back and reassessing where they are today. But from our standpoint at Broadsign, we're an open API, modularly built, full stack monetization platform, right? So that makes people like my job very easy because I can actually meet customers where they are today. So like we would say in store, part of capturing this intent to purchase, is largely built upon the ability to meet a shopper in that moment, right? And so I think from a platform perspective, that is one way that we try to position ourselves as Broadsign being open API, an open partnership ecosystem to help drive the best business outcomes, is remaining modular and meeting customers where they are today. So I think that flexibility allows us to coexist a lot, being hardware agnostic, being able to work on a lot of different hardware media players that are out there in the market with integrations with a lot of manufacturers themselves, right? And then I think that probably the last layer would be, the data, certainly. So I think we say yours stays yours, right? A lot of times when we're talking about data from a retail perspective. And I think a lot of that is really meaningless unless you can truly articulate how that data moves through a platform.
Okay.
If the export is clean, if there's an audit trail that any sort of internal governance teams or your brand teams have a lot of confidence in, is going to be necessary. So I think that's one of the reasons why IAB had published in-store standards, right? I think last December. And so I think we're seeing a lot of RMNs, especially in C-Store, start to embrace those. So
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about monetization at this point. At what stage should retailers be designing for monetization? And what do most teams kind of underestimate about what it actually takes to turn in-store media into meaningful revenue streams?
Yeah, and I think the trap is really at the funding case stage. You have a screen count case that's primarily CapEx.
Right.
Spend once, you're done. You've paid for your screens. You have a demand case that is OpEx, so your sales headcount and the brand relationships that that you fund every year. And I think most teams are gonna, they pick that CapEx because it's obviously the first flag that you plant in a brick and mortar, right, is to implement the infrastructure. Typically, it's easier to approve. And then by that time, you don't necessarily have a lot of budget left over for the parts that actually make you money, right? The internal investment that you're going to make. And so when we talk about monetization, I think the conversation really has to start even before the screens. I know that when we work with retailers, we sit alongside them in that design phase when we are considering monetization. And the three things that we really want to think about is how inventory gets packaged, what measurement framework suppliers will invest against, right? Mm-hmm. And then also which categories sort of get prioritized in what sequence.
Yeah.
And I think from there, we can bring in the right specialists for hardware, installation, day two, managed service partners, et cetera. And so I think, that's not necessarily a software conversation, right? Like that's an operating model conversation. And so I think that that's important to take into context because I would say most retailers or RMNs just getting started in their journey wouldn't necessarily back into that as a first conversation or first thing to consider, right? Mm-hmm. Until they're 6 months into a deployment, right? And we have to sort of walk backwards and sort of retrofit strategies into shoring things up.
Okay. So going, kind of beyond the infrastructure, what do you think the biggest operational gaps are in how retailers package inventory and access demand right now?
Sure. Well, I think the primary one is that I think inventory and package inventory by location is still being done predominantly today, right? So we're selling screens based off of location, based off of stores, DMAs. When the buy side is specifically trying to buy moments, you know what I mean? And so those two things are often at odds with each other. So they're after a category decider, in a beverage mission on a Friday afternoon, which is very specific. So location still sells, right? But I think it's the floor now, not necessarily the ceiling. And so any teams that I think kind of back in and find themselves sort of selling to that location, as their primary layer, are really selling, the commodity layer at this point. Mm-hmm. And so I think the second gap that we would want to think about is the fact that building programmatic in parallel to this, you know what I mean? Not necessarily bolted on later as an afterthought. So I think, I think today there's 91% of marketers now plan programmatic digital out of home, right? Whereas like 3 years ago, I think that number was 41%. There's a pretty big shift in terms of the business planning happening and how we orchestrate retail media with the rest of our operations. And so the advice would be, build direct now, right? And if we don't do this in parallel with programmatic in mind, by the time that we've considered programmatic 2 years from now, you might be missing out on the curve that we're currently bending to right now with the demand side.
Okay. So what then do you think relevance actually means in this setting, and how is it different from on-site or off-site media?
Yeah, and so those are three different things in three different places. Obviously, say on-site is purchase intent context, right? Okay. So that's the cleanest measurement in digital. You'd have off-site, which is audience-based and mature, right? And so for in-store relevance, this is really at the intersection, I would say, of mission, moment, and physical context. I'm not saying that it's measured better, or anything like that. I'm saying that it's different. And in a lot of ways, it's more decision proximate signal, right? Okay. So it's someone is 3 feet from a shelf, not 3 clicks and a day away, from making that decision. And so I think in-store is this inflection point of everyone's efforts, everyone that needs to succeed, right? From an advertiser to the internal marketing teams, the internal merchandising teams, the retailer itself, the platforms, the customers, hopefully buying something. So all of in-store really represents this inflection point in which all of our successes really just have to come together to make a good experience for a customer in a store,
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. So when you look at how stores are executing in-store media today, what are the most common missed opportunities, do you think? What could we be doing better in how content and placements are being activated?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I think the biggest one is really endemic versus non-endemic balance. Endemic CPGs are, trade budget money that, it's the fixed pool that you can fight for. While the non-endemic, represented by, things like auto, telecom, FinServe, a lot of those are going to be net new budgets, right? That was never going to touch a retailer's P&L in the first place. So a lot of that is a new revenue line, right? Not just reallocated dollars. So that's one part. But I think the honest caveat to that issue is basically that non-endemic should probably be considered as the long-term ceiling, right? That's not like today's revenue or anything like that. So I think the story and the byline for C-Store is build the relevance and the measurement now, right? So that by the time the demand sort of cascades down to C-Store, that's going to be a network that they want to invest in.
Okay.
And then I think, sort of to your point you touched on was the creative, the actual signal, right? How do we forget the signal in this massive world of retail media and everything we do? It's the exact message that we speak to the customer directly, right? And so that's actually one of the things that I think about is running static creative on a dynamic screen, for example, right? Like we have a lot of instances, I would say, where you might walk in and see a screen and it's the exact same creative as a poster, right, or a print collateral. So as we back into how do we personalize messaging and how do we actually drive purchase intent, I think that's something to certainly keep top of mind, right? Is like, let's leverage our retail media endpoints in a dynamic way because the infrastructure is there to begin with, right? And then I think there's a third thing too, that, treating in-store as one network instead of different sales conversations, right? And kind of going back to my earlier example of my 7 a.m. coffee run is very different than my 5:30 after I've gotten off work cold vault decision, right? So all of the different media units really mean something different to a shopper. Their values are different. And so I think internally with the RMNs, the more that we think about what the strategy is in capturing and meeting those people or meeting our shoppers in those moments, right, is where we're going to see success versus treating in store as just sort of one layer, right, with no nuance whatsoever. And I think that's where you start looking at how you drive incremental lift.
Okay. So we were talking before just a little bit about the obvious differences between a 53 store chain and a 5,000 store chain. How should retailers think about scaling demand and monetization if they don't have massive national store footprint? How do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually argue that footprint perhaps is not the right unit anymore.
Okay.
I would think about it in the terms that supply path access is the right thing to sort of measure and to consider here, really. For example, a few hundred store regional operator most likely wouldn't be able to get a DSP to integrate with them directly, right? But if that same operator is integrated into an SSP that pulls hundreds of publishers, right? And now all of a sudden you're into something that DSPs actually do integrate with. And so the honest caveat to that is necessarily the positioning, right? It's not parity yet, but in this scenario, I would say that that pool is actually the product and not the footprint. So if we think about it in that way, the way that you position your inventory and integrating with an SSP is actually going to be the more realistic path, right? I think that, demand is really for most DSP dollars, they are still primarily weighted towards grocery, mass, and pharmacy today, right? And so I think aggregation today is positioning of when demand routes down, not necessarily parity to everyone else. And so a lot of that is actually going to be borrowed versus, you own that demand.
Okay. Well, we're going to round out this conversation here and just do a little bit of looking ahead. What do you think will separate retail media networks that, kind of plateau from those that really become scalable and really become long-term media businesses?
Yeah, well, I think the easy answer that I would push back on is architecture, right? Right. So I think most C-store networks that might be experiencing plateauing right now is probably more due to category problems, right, versus an architectural problem. With demand still concentrating primarily in mass and grocery, you have measurement that's still not standardized across the board, right? And then I think we see in some cases where buyers are pulling spin from networks that can't prove relevance. So within that context, you can't really engineer your way out of a demand problem.
Right.
But the architecture that RMNs and retailers pick today allow you to position you to in terms of how much of this demand you actually do catch once it comes down the downstream. So, and I think that closed networks have a place, especially when you want to consolidate your stack and outsource certain components of that, whether that's capex associated with the purchase of screens and media players, the actual infrastructure, or the sell side of the inventory. But what are you really sacrificing at that point? Are you sacrificing the measurement methodology like we talked about earlier or are you sacrificing the direct relationships with your brands, right? And so I think closed networks do have a place. I think that if you're someone, the largest retailer in the world, for example, you will have the gravity to force demand. So closed might be the right call for you. But I would say for a majority of people operating within this space, I think that is the type of math that just doesn't work out. So for a majority of us, I think gravity is something that we borrow, through aggregation. And it's not necessarily going to be something that we own. So I think the architectural decisions that C-Store makes, especially over the next 2 years, are really going to be a bet on whether the C-Store demand routes down, which is really more of a balance sheet decision than anything. And so hopefully that can show up in their software, the hardware contracts, the demand path, and who bills the retailers directly, and whether or not they keep the measurement methodology like we talked about. So I think that's how you kind of tell what open is in terms of a posture versus, just sort of a pitch, right? So I think just sort of wrapping up, the simplest version, I think, in all of this for me is the easy money era is sort of over, right? A quarter of retail marketers are already, pulling budget out of networks that can't prove outcomes. So obviously that has to be the primary focus moving forward. So I would say the ones that survive, in the next 2 years are going to be the ones with not the ones with the most screens per se. They'll be the ones that keep their data, that keep their audience relationships, they keep their measurement methodology under their own control. But in a large part, all of us are still participating in in store, the fastest growing surface in retail media right now. And a lot of this infrastructure is kind of being poured right now as we're sort of standing on it. And so I think the logic is really building for the long arc and really considering some of the things end to end before we jump into CapEx or before we start making some of these conversations, I think is where open partnerships, open platforms have a lot to provide to retailers that provide them transparency and the optionality that they're going to want to maintain as they build their retail media networks.
Drew, fantastic information. Really, really great insight. I'm so grateful to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and so on behalf of CSP and Broadsign, thank you all so much for being here, and catch us the next time on the At Your Convenience podcast. Thank you so much. See you then.